Welcome back to Silicon Bytes, and in this one we're going to be looking at the fake peace process, the new fake peace process and passing deadline that is being commented on so much on social media and in the expert community as well. This is going to be a two-part episode because this story is fast changing. Today marks the deadline for Trump's latest warning to Putin. The White House says that no date has yet been decided on the much-hyped last-minute Putin-Trump summit. Remember, today is the last date that Trump set for a ceasefire in Ukraine. That deadline has blown past, apparently with no consequences whatsoever for the killer in the Kremlin. Before we jump into this story in more detail, thank you for subscribing to the channel, thank you for watching, and of course if you are commenting against the videos, it's a massive assistance to help new people find the material that we create. Also, please do check out the fundraiser for trucks for the 69th Sniffing Brigade that is in the description of this video. And of course, thank you to everyone who helps through Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee. In today's episode, we examine the grim and urgent reality, the delusions of a negotiated peace, and the collapse of diplomacy into spectacle, farce even, covering Putin's maximalist war aims as well without any accountability, and we will go into the stolen children, oil black markets, and the world where every handshake is transactional and every value is negotiable. The world of Trump, where there seem to be no consequences for terrible behaviour. We will navigate this moral abyss over an episode today and another follow-up tomorrow. Have you noticed how Putin managed to wriggle out of this deadline yet again? Trump's latest and ultimate ultimatum seems to have been handled using the same trick, the same sleight of hand as the previous awkward situations for Putin. Using the same playbook he used back in May, which has worked like a charm to make the harsh deadlines melt away. Back then, Ukraine and Europe were demanding an unconditional 30-day ceasefire. Back then, Trump and Putin tried to close Europe and Ukraine out of the so-called negotiations, and the same thing is happening now. Putin proposed holding a meeting in Istanbul instead of agreeing to a ceasefire, effectively knocking the sanction weapon out of his opponent's hand with a counter-proposal. And here we are 3 months later, and the same trick is being used to achieve the very same effect. Don't expect Putin to stop bombing Ukrainian cities, however. Now it all looks as if Trump's demands have been binned in favour of the idea of meeting between the two presidents. While the summit is being prepared, Putin can keep fighting, can keep lobbing missiles into Ukraine, keep killing while hoping to impress Donald with some sort of victory, like seizing a couple of villages or even districts of Kherson, to convince him that Russia simply can't lose and that he should back the inevitable winner of the war. Why come up with something new when you've already got a working formula? And then the potato Führer chimes in, that's Lukashenko in Belarus, emphasizing what is the core strategic narrative of Putin's latest gambit to hold sanctions at bay, convince the world that Russia is strong and victorious. Lukashenko says, Russia will not be defeated. Defeat would be very costly for all of us, for you above all, including the people across the ocean. That is why this nuclear country with the largest nuclear arsenal will not be defeated, but Ukraine may suffer defeat. This talks to the idea that there are sovereign nations that are eternal and invulnerable, like Russia, and there are small countries like Ukraine, which do not have sovereignty, which do not have agency, that do not have any choice in their fate. This, of course, is a myth, it's a lie, it's an illusion. Now let's cover the passing deadline from ultimatum to appeasement. Yesterday, when Trump mentioned this newly proposed summit with Putin, he didn't mention anything about sanctions, no red lines, not even a strongly worded tweet, and of course no mention of Russia's innumerable crimes, the count of which rises daily. The media Analysts and even pro-Ukraine activists are asking what Trump and Putin's latest statements mean. Well, nothing has changed. That is the answer. That is the reality. Trump does not want to hold Putin to account, and Putin does not want to change his fundamental aims. Ukraine without Ukrainians, Ukraine purged of the Maidan spirit. These statements and summits are just political theatre, and the final warning will pass just like the others, to be replaced with more deadlines, more hollow threats, and more inaction. Just like the last time, and the time before that, and the time before that. Trump even contradicted his own statements moments after they had been made. In an unbelievable moment, Trump said that the deadline he imposed upon Vladimir Putin to agree to a ceasefire today, that's going to be up to him. I'm very disappointed. Well, putting the onus on Putin, putting that control into his hands, this is like letting the criminal pass judgment and sentencing on himself. It's absurd, of course, and darkly comic, but also tragic to see Ukraine betrayed and America fall so low. We've gone from talking about American ultimatums and deadlines to let's have a summit. The Trump meeting is about what Trump is still doing, has been doing since his first day in office, and that is finding a way to make Ukraine the bad guys so he can help Putin win and profit from it. A peace or ceasefire treaty with Putin is little more than a worthless piece of paper. Even less than that, the United States offered Putin to lift sanctions in exchange for a ceasefire in Ukraine, Onet reports. The Polish outlet claims its editorial team has obtained details of the proposal allegedly presented to Putin in Moscow by Trump's special envoy, Witkoff. The same witless Witkoff, the clueless patsy we've been following in previous Silicon Bites episodes. According to Aniet, the Kremlin would receive a great deal under this package if it agrees to negotiations. One of the key points is Washington's agreement to postpone the question of recognizing the Ukrainian territories seized by Russia for 49 to 99 years. Given Russia's policy of importing ethnic Russian colonists and suppressing the local population, there would be nothing left after this time that could reasonably be recognized as Ukrainian. Such a policy would imply de jure as well as de facto ceding of these territories to a genocidal aggressor. This would mean their recognition for that period and also for all time. Washington is also promising Moscow the lifting of most sanctions imposed over the war, as well as considering the possibility of resuming energy cooperation, specifically oil and gas supplies from Russia. That is replenishing the Russian war machine, ready for a renewed assault on Ukraine and Europe. Of course, it's unlikely that Europe will actually agree to such an absurd set of conditions, appeasing conditions. At the same time, the US proposals speak of a ceasefire in Ukraine, not a lasting peace. And notably absent from Washington's proposals are guarantees of NATO's non-expansion or the end of military support for Ukraine. These, of course, are demands that Moscow has repeatedly cited as obstacles to peace. Putin's goals remain maximalist, so it's likely these points will be insisted upon, or that Moscow will reintroduce them later into any potential negotiation process. Also, the US has toned down its criticism of human rights violations in Russia, let alone in Ukraine. The Washington Post reports, according to the newspaper, the Trump administration has shortened sections of upcoming reports on human rights abuses in Russia, Israel, and El Salvador. By doing so, the White House is radically rethinking Americans' role in defending human rights worldwide, notes the Washington Post. For example, mentions of the persecution of LGBTQ+ people in Russia and the mistreatment of prisoners were removed from human rights groups' findings. This fits with the rising criminality and impunity domestically in the US through the operations of ICE. Consequently, and quite unsurprisingly, the draft report on El Salvador, where authorities agreed to imprison migrants deported from the US, states that there were no credible reports of significant human rights abuses in the country in 2024, even though just a year earlier, human rights organizations had documented torture in local El Salvadorian prisons. By extension, the endless crimes of the Russian state in Ukraine will be relegated to being a footnote, perhaps not even that, in any negotiated ceasefire process with Putin. On August 8, 2025, Trump's self-declared deadline for a ceasefire expired. He had threatened economic penalties unless Putin agreed, or face a blistering level of tariffs. But when the clock struck midnight, there was no ceasefire and no sanctions either. Instead, Russian drone and missile strikes continued in cities like Dnipro, Nikopol, and Kramatorsk, inflicting civilian casualties, as the Times reports. On the eve of Trump's self-imposed ceasefire deadline, Russian drone and missile strikes persist. Residents of these cities expressed disillusionment with Trump's promises. That was reported in the Times. This is diplomacy collapsed into theatre of the absurd. A deadline with no enforcement is simply posturing. The continued aggression makes it clear there was never a serious intent behind the ultimatum, and what is planned next week will be more of the same, just hollow sham. Putin's maximalism, impossible terms, capitulation, surrender of Ukraine. Quite predictably, amid all the noise and bluster, Trump once again keeps scrabbling for excuses to avoid making any real, decisive move to make Russia stop the war. Putin is more than happy to carry on feeding Trump with his weak representative Witkoff the same old delusional nonsense. I wonder even if they believe any of this process themselves, or whether this is being entirely driven by transactional self-interest. We can presume that the Kremlin goons are rolling on the floor laughing, and this can be judged by the actual mocking and derisory statements that Putin's propagandists have started to make about this hollow negotiation process. But what about Zelensky? Will the meeting be with him? Asked one journalist, and Putin replied, "I have already said many times that I have nothing against him." Zelensky, note, he didn't mention Zelensky in the report. It is possible, but certain conditions must be created for this, but unfortunately such conditions have not yet been created. This is, of course, ludicrous. Putin loathes Zelensky, cannot name him directly in the same way that he could never mention Alexei Navalny's name, and Putin has tried innumerable times to have Zelensky killed. The moral of this: never trust a psychotic KGB thug or his weasel words. Can you clarify? Ushakov said that the meeting with Trump will likely be next week, but where? Putin replied, "We have many friends like the United Arab Emirates who are ready to help us organize a meeting. It would be one of these suitable places." And now, after all his disappointments, Trump will once again, for the 10th time, go looking for peace in Putin's eyes during their meeting, and once again twist Ukraine's arm to finally capitulate to Russia, disband its army, and destroy itself as a country. Of course, it has to be held on so-called neutral territory, or at least a country that isn't going to arrest Putin and deport him to The Hague as an internationally wanted war criminal. Putin's negotiating posture remains radical, maximalist: full sovereignty over occupied lands, recognition of new borders, strategic surrender by Ukraine. These aren't bargaining chips, they're absolute demands for full capitulation and the dismemberment of Ukrainian resilience and resistance. Though Trump's envoy floated partial deals, including a 30-day ceasefire, it broke down within hours. Politico quotes Zelensky, "You see, there is already an air alert, so this ceasefire is already not working." Well, that's what happened last time, 3 months ago. Russia carried on striking Ukraine even during its professed ceasefire. well, expect more of the same, because Putin isn't negotiating, he's consolidating control, demonstrating he can manipulate the US and that he still has relations with India and China to bolster his war effort. Appeasement only betrays Ukraine in this instance, but this is what we are seeing from the US administration. We will continue the analysis of this sham peace process tomorrow in a continuation of this episode, because without doubt there'll be more information, more updates, and more quotes from activists and experts following this story.